War Between Worlds, Chapter 10, A Crop of Issues. Rook was amused to learn that his brother had cobbled the space drive for the Harvester together from farm tools, cutlery, and a few spare hangers. Learning that his partner's transformation jury rig now very much admired the young Ravana for that was even funnier. But neither of them really had a chance to think about it right now. Young One was claiming that Ravana had been invaded. He also had every faith that Jen could single-handedly handle the invasion. A worldwide invasion is a big thing. We're going to do everything we can, but right now we need to figure out exactly what we're dealing with. Jen said. It seemed to placate Young One for now, but as she shot a look at Rook, he wasn't exactly sure when they had gotten to the point of silent communication, but he knew from the look in her eyes exactly what she was thinking. The look in her eyes told him that she was worried for the people of Ravana, and honestly, so was he. Ravana was a peaceful world. They didn't have many violent conflicts. There hadn't been any wars on Ravana for centuries. There were many who still practiced the art of Ravana Kai, but Rook couldn't see what use that would be against the guns of the Incursion Empire. But as Ravana loomed in front of them, Rook frowned. There were no ships circling the planet, no blockade indicative of an invasion. He glanced at Jen. She was frowning too, her brow furrowed in a way that meant she was confused. He'd admit to a certain amount of confusion himself. Young One wasn't one to lie, especially about something important like this. But as he landed the Harvester near the small plumber base, there was nothing. No ships in the atmosphere, no war machines, no troops on the ground. There was nothing happening out of the ordinary. Jen frowned. That's unusual for an invasion, she pointed out, spinning the dial on the Omnitrix. I'm going to do some quick recon. See if there's anyone at the plumber base. Before she could transform, Rook laid a hand on her shoulder. Be careful. She nodded to him and transformed into a large chameleon-like alien before fading from sight entirely. Rook turned and found his brother grinning at him. It was a mischievous look that he had seen before. When he had first applied for the Plumber Academy, he had to sneak out of the house to do it. Young One had caught him sneaking back in, and Rook had to do his chores up until the day he told their parents that he'd applied and been accepted to keep his younger brother quiet. What? He hadn't done anything odd, nothing for Young One to have that gleam of mischief in his eyes. But the gleam persisted.
I have seen that look before, Blonko, but not on your face.
Rook blinked at his brother. I have no idea what you are talking about. He tried to insist, but the fur on his face puffed slightly as he blushed. He turned away from his brother towards the small plumber outpost. Come, we should hurry. Young One trailed close behind him, still with that mischievous gleam in his eyes.
I am young, not stupid, brother. I have seen that look on the faces of couples courting around town.
Blonko bristled at his brother's words. I do not know what you are talking about. Now hush. Rook snuck his brother up to the plumber base and frowned. It was silent and unlit. Young One frowned. Agent Watson does not leave the base unattended long. This is odd. Young One nodded.
He was with Rook Shar in the field when the attack occurred. I can show you.
But before Young One could brush off, Jen's transformation chameleon reappeared. Everything seems to be business as usual, she said, shaking her head, transforming back into herself. There's only one odd thing that I found, but I didn't exactly get the chance for a tour last time, so I don't know if it's new or not. Rook nodded. Young One, show us to the site you first saw the incursions. Jen, you can point out this oddity on the way. Young One took the lead, careful as he could be, about creeping around rather than racing off. Rook leaned closer to his partner. What do you think? Jen frowned. I'm not sure. By all appearances, nothing's happening, but I can't picture Young One lying about something this big. You know him better than I do. She looked up at him as they crept around. He would never lie about something like this. Small things, maybe, but never an emergency like this. Jen nodded. That's kind of what I figured. And I'll grant that it's possible that maybe they beat the Incursions. Unlikely without the tech, but not impossible. But there would be something. Some wreckage, anything at all, but everything's quiet. She frowned deeper as he nodded. Then she seemed to spot what she had been talking about earlier. Hold up a second, young one. The small Ravana threw his arms into the air.
What am I holding up?
He asked, and Jen held back a snort. Sorry, Earth expression. It means wait for a second. We can see what I was talking about from up here. She jerked her thumb to the edge of the plateau where the plumber base sat. Down below was a river, and on the other side of that were the amber ogia fields, where Rook could just barely make out figures working. That relieved some of the pressure that had gathered around his heart since Young One had brought his dark pronouncement to them. But it returned when Jen drew his attention just downstream of the fields. When did Ravana install plumbing? Both Ravanaganders frowned at her, but she was right. There were large pipes running from the fields over the river. They disappeared from sight soon after, sinking into the ground. They were certainly not here when we were last, Rook stated, like that wasn't already obvious. He looked at Young One, who shook his head.
They were not here when I left.
Jen let out a long breath, wrinkling her nose the way she did when someone forced her to do math. That look was usually reserved for the times Rook found her working on her homework, but after a moment she spoke. Young One's been gone about a day. That's about how long it would take to get to Earth and back in the Harvester. She paused, letting out a breath between her teeth. We need to find your family, but we need to not be seen doing it. The more time we're here without anyone knowing, the more of an advantage we have. Rook nodded, and the three of them set off again. Young One caught a hold of Jen's sleeve.
What do you think has happened?
He looked scared, but stood straight and tall, trying to be as brave as he could. Jen shook her head. I don't know, but we're going to figure it out. When they reached the field adjoining the Rook family home, they found large piles of amber ogia, more than there had been during the harvest festival. Rook's father, mother, and 2 of his 3 sisters were there working the field. Before Jen could stop him, Young One raced out from behind their rock. Jen swore under her breath, but stepped out as well, Rook following her lead.
Father, Mother, you are well!
Rook Dog glanced up and frowned slightly. Young One, you scamp. Where have you been? We've been worried sick. Both Jen and Rook paused. That had been a contraction. Then Rookdaw spotted them and frowned as his gaze flickered back to Young One. How did you manage to contact your brother? He was concerned. Worried something had happened. Is all well here? Rook asked, stepping up next to his little brother. We're fine. We're harvesting at a quite prolific rate. His voice didn't sound quite right, almost robotic. Rook frowned. At this time of year. But his father didn't answer him. Come, it's time for dinner. With few options left to them, they followed the family back into the house. But Jen exchanged a look with her partner. Something wasn't right. Dinner drove that home for both of them. It was awkward and meager. Despite the amount of amber ogia they were harvesting, there was almost none on the table. Rook's mother and sisters had yet to speak, and Rook Shar was still absent, though no one but the 3 new arrivals seemed to notice. Jen decided to test something. It was a bit of a risk, but only if she was wrong. So, I was thinking, Young One would make an excellent engineer. You should sign him up for classes over the extranet. Rook Blonko looked at his partner like she had just stated an intention to run off and work for Vilgax. There was no way his father would allow an extranet set up in the house. But he was even more shocked by his father's response. Is that so? Well, if you think that's a good idea, I say we should. Jen kicked her partner under the table before he could express his disbelief at this pronouncement from his stalwartly traditional father. Jen nodded. Yeah, I could get you the names of a few Galvin teachers. That caused a bit of a reaction. Rookdaw's eye twitched. Of course, if you think the Galvins would make good teachers, and I use the term loosely. And it was with that one phrase that both of them knew who was behind this, though the how still eluded them. After all, Dr. Psychobos was supposed to be locked up in a Galvan prison. Now they just had to work out how he'd done it and how they were going to undo it. They were separated after dinner. Young One and Rook were to sleep in Young One's room and Jen in Rook's old room. But sleep didn't come. That was probably a good thing, though, because as soon as the lights down the hall had gone out, the doors slipped open and Jen crept in. Something isn't right on Ravana. We need to figure this out. Young One perked up. Having not spent as much time around Jen as Rook, he hadn't picked up on their conversations.
You believe me?
Jen nodded. I believe you. You know not to lie about things like this, but we need to get out of here. She jerked her thumb at the window and carefully rearranged the bedding so it looked like there were still figures in them. Young One frowned.
How do you know to do this?
Jen grinned. Well, my parents didn't always know about the Omnitrix. I've had to sneak out a lot over the past 6 years. She left it at that as they exited via the window. Rook fell into step beside her. You did not wear the Omnitrix that whole time, he pointed out, sounding almost amused. Jen grinned. No, I didn't. No one has a perfect record, Rook. Come on, we're going to follow that pipeline, see where it ends up. Find the end of the pipeline, we find Psychobos and whatever he's doing with the Amberogia. She took the lead, and the two of them careful to keep Young One between them. Bringing along an untrained child wasn't exactly a good idea, but leaving him behind would have been worse. Chapter 11, Controlling Crustacean. Tracking the pipeline down its length was easy enough. Finding Rook Shar and Agent Watson was a relief. Shar! Rook pulled his sister into a hug. Young One clung to his sister's leg. Jen held out a hand to Watson. Nice to meet you. Grandpa Max has mentioned you. Watson shook her hand. How is the old geezer? Jen laughed at her grandfather's old partner. Oh, you know, still kicking. Having quite a bit of fun running plumber ops on Earth and in that whole parsect. Watson laughed. Yeah, he'd enjoy that. They turned back to the family. Rook stepped over to Jen. Shar, you have already met my partner. Jen nodded and held out a hand to Shar. Shar pulled her into a hug.
Thank you for caring for my brother. Now we need to save Ravana.
Jen nodded. Yeah, could you let us in on what's been happening? Things up top have gone a little bit nuts, and your father is using contractions. Jen pointed it out as nonchalantly as she could, but it had honestly freaked her out quite a bit. She'd been working with Rook long enough to be freaked out when Ravanaganders used contractions. Shar frowned, but nodded. She and Agent Watson filled them in on the way to where the Amberogia was being processed. They made it into the basement of the processing plant before things went wrong. Something popped up in front of Shar and Watson, spraying both of them with orange mist. Jen snagged the back of Young One's shirt and pulled him back out of the way of the mist, swiftly pulling her collar of her shirt up over her nose and mouth. The mist cleared quickly, but left Shar and Watson stumbling for a moment. Shar, are you well? Is that what they sprayed in the fields? Rook asked, a touch of panic in his voice.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Shar's voice had gone robotic, just like her father's. Jen stepped in front of Young One. Okay, mind control missed. That answers that. Jen stated, spinning the dial on the Omnitrix. Shar, we will fix this. Rook pulled the proto-tool off his shoulder. Nothing needs fixing, Agent. Everything here is fine. Watson's voice was robotic, too. Jen transformed and swore as she wound up stuck. Gravitac was too big for this hallway. But between her and Rook, they managed to subdue Watson and Shar. They were pinned to the wall with restraints from the proto-tool, but as Jen transformed back to herself, she had a thought. Young One, you stay here. Keep an eye on those two. Jen nodded to Shar and Watson. We're gonna go take care of the bad guys. She and Rook nodded to each other and took off down the tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, they found a lab and the perpetrators of this whole plot, Dr. Psychobos and Princess Atea. Jen found a new transformation, Astrodactyl, and used it to destroy most of the mind control juice that Psychobos had created. He and Atea escaped with one of the vials, only partially filled. Atea left with a parting threat that the troubles on Ravana had just begun. Everyone had been released from the mind control, but where but there were hidden troops all over the planet. They met up with Rook's family soon after a small ambush they encountered and quickly took down. Rook was shaken at the threat against his people. I should never have left Ravana. I will remain behind to assist in defeating the incursions. Jen's heart plummeted. She knew she would do the same thing in his position. She really couldn't blame him. She shook her head and turned away, stepping out of the crowd. She pulled out her communicator and called the nearby plumber base. They would send a skiff and several squads of plumbers to help oust the invaders. Rook could handle himself. But back where she'd left him, his father had a few things to say. You have found your place. It is not on Ravana. I have never been prouder of you, Blonko. But our minds are clear. We will handle these invaders. Rook blinked at his father. You are proud of me? He could barely believe the words his father had spoken. The older Ravana nodded. Both your mother and I are proud. You have had a great impact on your siblings. Why do you think Shar wishes to join the plumbers, and Young One wishes to see the stars? Rook smiled at his siblings. Ravana is but a small corner of the universe. We can handle ourselves. Rookda embraced his son. Go. Rook nodded and embraced his siblings before racing after his partner. Together, they would discover what was happening and deal with the incursions for good. Jen was waiting outside the tunnels. Rook frowned slightly. She was standing with her back to him, but her posture was stiff. Jen? She nearly jumped and scrubbed at her face before turning to face him. Plumbers are sending a skiff and a few squads to help out. She fell silent again. So, this is goodbye. Rook shook his head. My people can handle themselves. With the help of the plumbers, they will defeat the incursions left here. My place is with you. With the plumbers, I mean. Jen smiled, glancing away from him. They were both blushing, though neither seemed to notice. I'm glad you're sticking around. We need to get back to Earth, regroup, see if we can figure out where the incursions are headed next. Jen stated after a moment. Dust flew as several plumber ships arrived. Oh good, the cavalry's here. Rook frowned as they headed to a small skiff, plumbers nodding at them as they went. I do not believe they brought horses with them, Jen. Rook pointed out, sounding a bit confused. Jen laughed loudly, shaking her head at her partner. She might never say it aloud, but she would have missed him so much if he'd decided to stay. She would never have held it against him. She knew how hard it was to let family fight their own battles. But she would have been upset regardless. He was quiet as he hopped into the pilot's seat of the skiff. You doing okay there, Rook? He nodded as he pulled the ship out of the atmosphere. I was thinking. Shar has expressed interest in joining the plumbers. She'd be an excellent plumber. I agree. I was thinking that if you were to write her a letter of recommendation, she would be assured a spot. Jen grinned at her partner. Of course. When would she need it by? Rook smiled at Jen as they sped through the stars.